Hey everybody, welcome to The Bottom Line. Michael Noland here, and tonight we're going to be covering the Beatles album Help, a few things about the film as well. But in regard to the album, is it the Beatles' near masterpiece? And by saying that, what do I mean? Well, more on that after I take my usual short walk on the beach. Alright, so due to the success of A Hard Day's Night, the budget for the Beatles' next film was doubled. This meant it could be shot in color. And the original title bandied around for the film was actually 8 Arms to Hold You, evidently suggested by Ringo. Now, the entire album was recorded over a series of 12 sessions, 6 of those sessions for the songs that actually appeared in the film. Now, during this series, we've tried to cover Beatle recording techniques that they used. And of course, with each album, the Beatles getting better at using the equipment that they knew, obtaining new equipment like the 4-track studios they now had access to. And it's at this point where the Beatles are starting to blossom just a bit in doing whatever they can to achieve the sounds they hear in their heads. Now, there were 2 major changes in the way the Beatles recorded their music, starting with the Help album. First of all, they would let the tapes run from end to end, and they would rehearse. That way they could go back and listen to what's happening, and they had more to say about what was being put on the tape. Then when they had it all together, they would run back to the beginning of that tape and then start recording proper. Now, on one hand, this makes no sense. It was against EMI policy, a good policy, by the way, not to reuse tape. And the reason for that is if you re-record over tape, there is a certain amount of signal loss each time you do that. But running the tape in this manner, straight through, and then once again, the Beatles realized that the loss of signal was insignificant, and they were more free to create in a live fashion in the studio. This is important, and it's with this album that the Beatles really start to take advantage of overdubbing. It's at this point, with each song, they overdub until they achieve the sound that they hear. And as so many tracks on this album obviously display, this system worked really well for the Beatles at this point. Now, as usual, I'm going to start this video by covering the recordings for the singles that came out with this album. And that, of course, is the magnificent Ticket to Ride. Now, by most accounts, this is mainly John's song, no doubt. Paul has claimed helping out writing the song. George Martin remembers Paul meeting with John just before the recording of the song to finish the song up. And there are some McCartney fingerprints on this song. As Steve Lambley brings up in his excellent book, And the Band Played on Help, he said, the unusual coda at the end has a McCartney flair, that My Baby Don't Care. And McCartney said that he helped with the melody just a bit when they were developing the harmonies for the song. The B-side to the single is the wonderful Yes It Is. Now, John even later admitted that this was him attempting to rewrite This Boy. And the vocal approach is similar. Now, the harmonies are similar, but somehow more mature. And is a nice bridge between This Boy and the magnificent harmonies on John's Because on the Abbey Road album. Now, the album starts off with the title track Help. Years later, in a Rolling Stone interview, he said that this was originally written as a ballad and that he wasn't really happy with the way the Beatles recorded it, even saying that maybe he would have to remake it one day. Now, in that same interview, he complained that later in the Beatles' career that McCartney was always fiddling with his music and bringing it into different directions that he didn't necessarily agree with. And one has to wonder if this is one of the songs he was talking about. I believe it was McCartney's suggestion that before John would sing a line, him and George would introduce the line. Either way, whether it was John's idea or Paul's idea, I think it was a choice idea, and I'll tell you why. By preceding John at some times in the song, George and Paul are almost coaxing John to admit that he needs help. Later on, following his vocal, it's almost as if they're saying, yes, everything he has said is totally correct. We agree. It was also McCartney's idea for the drum pattern there for Ringo to play. On the song Night Before, it's John that brings in a new instrument. The sound you hear on this song is him playing a Hohner electric pianette. And of course, this is indicative of what the Beatles would continue to do to explore new sounds and new instruments and take advantage of instruments that they weren't aware of to the fullest degree. Of course, as we stated in my last video, John at this point is influenced by Bob Dylan. In his song, You've Got to Hide Your Love Away, we hear this influence in full bloom. Now, it's interesting here, the flute solo played is the first time that an outside musician plays on a Beatle record other than George Martin since the Beatles' Love Me Do sessions, where they used a session drummer instead of Ringo. And of course, that flute solo was played by EMI session player Johnny Scott. And that flute solo, I always thought it was just a flute. It's actually a duet, and Johnny Scott plays both parts. Of course, in this song, we see John digging very deep, becoming more personally expressive in his lyrics. Next up, I Need You by George Harrison. You know, it was in my last video that on one of the songs that George recorded, it was him playing the guitar and John fiddling with George's volume knob to get that sound. But at the point of recording Help, George has gotten himself a volume pedal, and he uses it to full effect on I Need You. And on this album, George Harrison actually writes 2 songs, and that's something for the most part, George was always assured of in the future. But once again, here we see the Beatles using something, utilizing something they're not familiar with. As a matter of fact, it seems that the more unfamiliar with an instrument or a technique or a piece of equipment that the Beatles were, the more fond they were of exploring those options. Of course, with Another Girl, here we see maturation in the lyrics again. Here is not just a lost puppy teen boy wanting to hold your hand. Of course, this is followed up by John's You're Gonna Lose That Girl. John's song is almost an answer to the person in Paul's song. But once again, we see the lyrics maturing. Not fully yet, but they are arriving. Now, side 2 starts off with Act Naturally, of course, a vocal for Ringo, and of course, it's followed by John's It's Only Love, probably his weakest offering on the album. You know, years later, even he admitted he wasn't too fond of the song. Of course, that's followed by George Harrison's second offering on the album, You Like Me Too Much, and although this song wasn't as commercial as his side 1 offering, it still showed George's growth. And that's followed by Paul McCartney's Tell Me What You See. And I'll just let Paul McCartney's own words describe that song. He called it filler. But the next song up is one of the Beatles and Paul McCartney's very finest songs. And that, of course, is I've Just Seen a Face. Here, Paul starts to explore not country western, but a almost country folk aspect in his writing. And he would continue to explore that through his entire career. Just the lilt of the song is just so genuine. Now, the next song up is Paul McCartney's magnificent Yesterday. This song is not only a masterpiece, but it is the most covered song in the history of recording. Of course, the Beatles were hesitant to even put it on the album because besides Paul playing acoustic guitar and the vocals, the Beatles are not on this recording. Instead, this time, 2 violins, a viola, and a cello accompany Paul. Now in future videos, we'll take a closer look at these classic songs by the Beatles, but in this series, we're covering the albums in general. And so it's at this point we move on to the last track of the album, Dizzy Miss Lizzy. Enough said. Now my question, of course, at the beginning of the video is Help, a near masterpiece, was a bit tongue-in-cheek, I admit. If the output of side 2 was equal to the output of side 1, I would say Help would have been the Beatles' second masterpiece. Instead, we're presented with a very uneven album. Once again, the Beatles go to the well once too often with 2 covers on side 2. At this point, as a fan, I was not interested in listening to covers by the Beatles. I wanted to hear the songs that they wrote. But all in all, a really strong album nonetheless. And certainly, at least in my opinion, levels above Beatles for Sale. So the Beatles at this point have put out 5 albums and they've managed 1 masterpiece, at least in my opinion. But not to worry, starting with the very next album, the Beatles seem to be able to do no wrong. And of course, that's the magnificent Rubber Soul, and that will be next in this series of videos. Once again, a shout out to all of our viewers. Thank you for sharing. We appreciate it. That's how we've gotten to over 21,000 views so far. A big thank you. We are now at 196 subscribers. We are 4 away from 200. If you enjoy this kind of content, please consider subscribing. All you have to do is hit that subscribe button and hit that top bell notification, and you'll be notified of all future videos. I guarantee it. This is The Bottom Line. I'm Michael Noland, and we'll see you in the next video.